as I was saying to Don earlier, it's not a great read by modern standards. It's not like the new John Grisham novel and you curl up by the fireplace and want to read the whole thing. But it had an amazing impact at the time, because at the time, even people who weren't really pro-slavery, they still kind of put up with the peculiar institution. But when Uncle Tom's Cabin came out, it sort of gave a voice to the anti-slavery movement. And it had pretty stunning implications. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, who lived from 1811 to 1896, unfortunately most of the pictures you see of her are toward the 1896 part of her life. You don't see pictures of her as a young girl, or even at the time she wrote this book. Seventh child of revivalist Lyman Beecher, and sister of abolitionist preacher Henry Ward Beecher, and I put that in for Gus Cook. Anti-slavery novel first appeared in 1851 in an abolitionist newspaper called The National Era. It would go on to sell 1 million copies before the Civil War. Now, 1 million copies even today is a big deal. But think about pre-Civil War, it sold 1 million copies. And that gives you some idea of the impact it had, because it helped turn mass Northern's opinion against slavery. And this is a lithograph from 1899, I saw it there briefly. And the lithograph shows Uncle Tom, and it shows the little girl next to him, and he's reading the Bible to her. And that's really a theme that you see all through Uncle Tom's Cabin, that really the good guy is Uncle Tom, and the bad guy is, well, most everybody else. So that's really part of the theme. So Stowe actually included her views on slavery in the book. So in case you had read the book and didn't get the fact that she was anti-slavery, she actually included it at the end. So it says, for many years of her life, the author avoided all reading upon or allusion to the subject of slavery, considering it to be too painful to be inquired into, and one which advancing light and civilization would certainly live down. But since the Legislative Act of 1850, when she heard with perfect surprise and consternation, Christian and humane people actually recommending the remanding escaped fugitives into slavery as a duty binding on good citizens. I assume this is the Fugitive Slave Act she's referring to, but the Kansas and Nebraska Act was around the same time, and that was just as bad. When she heard on all hands from kind, compassionate, and estimable people in the free states of the North, deliberations and discussions as to what Christian duty could be on this head, she could only think, these men Christians cannot know what slavery is. If they did, such a question could never be open for discussion. And from this arose a desire to exhibit it in a living dramatic reality. She has endeavored to show it fairly in its best and its worst phases. In its best aspect, she has perhaps been successful. But oh, who shall say what yet remains untold in that valley and shadow of death that lies on the other side. So her anti-slavery views permeate Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was very specifically written for a political agenda. I think the Fugitive Slave Act also makes you think a little about civil disobedience, because sometimes people say, well, if it's the law, you should always obey the law. There should never be a point where you shouldn't obey the law. But what if it's the law that if a slave escapes from the South and gets captured in the North, then the law is you're supposed to return the slave to his master in the South? Well, basically what she's saying is, well, that may be the law, but it's not right. It's not Christian, it's not ethical. So we shouldn't do that. So it kind of makes you think a little bit. A key theme of Uncle Tom's Cabin is redemption. The idea that people can change and put aside their prejudices. Because you do see people throughout the book who are touched by Uncle Tom, and they become less prejudiced. There's a slave hunter named Tom Loper. And his job is to hunt down escaped slaves, so he is not viewed in a very positive light as the book goes on. And he changes after being physically healed by some Quakers. So he kind of has a road to Damascus experience because somebody helped him when he was in bad shape. Two overseers working for the hated Simon Legree become Christians after seeing the deep faith and humbleness of Uncle Tom. Now, probably the figure in this book who is even better known than Uncle Tom in popular consciousness is Simon Legree. And people will use that name to describe somebody who's terrible, and they may not even know where the name came from. Well, Simon Legree is the epitome of the worst slaveholder you can imagine. He's the one that whips them for small infractions. He's the one that wants to shoot runaway slaves, etc., etc. Our forgiveness is also a theme. After Uncle Tom is severely beaten by Simon Legree's men, Tom forgives them, and that's what causes their conversion, because they just beat the heck out of him, and then he tells them that he forgives them, and that has a really big impact. Uncle Tom's faith is tested. It's a lot like Job in the Bible, and considering she was a very religious person, I'm sure that was the whole point, is that he was a modern-day Job. He suffers repeated beatings at the hands of Simon Legree, and the final beating leads to his death. But he never blames God, he never gives up his faith. But maybe the biggest theme in the whole book is how should Christians react to slavery? That's really what the book's all about. Prior to Uncle Tom's cabin, most Christians in the North thought the Christian thing to do was to follow the law. Christians should follow the law. And if a slave did escape and came up to the North, he should be returned because that's the law. Well, what she wanted to do was tell people how awful it was being a slave on a plantation in the South, to get them to think, well, maybe that's not what we should be doing. Maybe we should be helping them escape, not returning them to their masters. So this book, which sold 1 million copies before the war, it changed Northern opinion. It was banned in the South. You couldn't buy it in the South. But in the North, it really changed people's opinions. And here's a couple excerpts, just to give you an idea. If any of our refined and Christian readers object to the society into which this scene introduces them, let us beg them to begin and conquer their prejudices in time. The catching business, the capturing of escaped slaves, we beg to remind them is rising to the dignity of a lawful and patriotic profession. So she's saying, well, wait a second, it shouldn't be. And second one, these two, he's talking about two people named Susan and Emily, are to be sold tomorrow in the same lot with the St. Clair servants. And the gentleman to whom they belong and to whom the money for their sales to be transmitted is a member of a Christian church in New York, who will receive the money and go thereafter to the sacrament of his Lord and theirs, and think no more of it. So here's a northerner who's a prominent church member who thinks nothing of making a profit out of the sale of slaves. The legend has it that Harriet Beecher Stowe met with, she did meet with Abraham Lincoln in November 1862. The legend says that when Lincoln met her, he said, "So you were the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." And some people, that might be kind of a lot to put on their shoulders, is to accuse them of being the ones that started the war. But she took that as a compliment, because she thought, just like John Brown did, she thought slavery was such a terrible institution that if it needed a war to be fought to end it, then so be it, let there be legal war. So that's one of my favorite quotes from the Civil War. It is indicative of the impact that Uncle Tom's Cabin had on the North. It really changed the Northern opinion. It made the abolitionist movement, which had been around since the 1830s, but it kind of made it much more prominent. It was okay then to say you were an abolitionist. You could say it publicly. And there she is. There's Harriet Beecher Stowe.